I was recently speaking with a private equity consultant who specializes in emerging markets. He was showing me his heat map of global risk, and his finger stopped on Brazil, a consolidated democracy with a vibrant press and free elections. He gave a frustrated sigh and quickly moved his finger across the ocean to a specific coastal province in China. His expression shifted instantly, his eyes sharpened with a kind of cold, calculating respect. "Everyone tells me to invest in the inclusive systems," he said, tapping the map of South America. "But every time I look at the data, I see a mess of shifting regulations and bureaucratic whims. It's like trying to build a house on quicksand." He then pointed back to the east. "Over there, I might not have a vote, and I certainly don't have a protest, but I have something much more valuable to a balance sheet, a contract that doesn't blink." He wasn't talking about ideology or human rights. He was talking about a single dry metric that outweighs the ballot box in the eyes of global capital: the rule of law. To him, the Asian paradox wasn't a theoretical puzzle. It was a lived reality. He showed me a spreadsheet comparing the predictability of judges in various regimes. In his view, a Weberian bureaucracy, one that is cold, meritocratic, and shielded from political noise, is a far more powerful engine for growth than a parliament full of shouting voices. What struck me was his total indifference to the political label of a country. He didn't care if a regime was inclusive or extractive in its politics, as long as it was inclusive in its legal security. This jarring contradiction, the idea that an autocracy can offer more economic certainty than a democracy, is exactly what the data is starting to confirm. While we've been told for decades that democracy is the prerequisite for prosperity, a China dummy and a set of rigorous econometric models suggest we might have been looking at the wrong map entirely. It raises a haunting question for nations like Brazil. If you have the freedom to vote but lack the integrity of the rule, are you actually just choosing your own stagnation?
So, starting off with a pretty heavy quote there.
Yeah, but it really sets the stage perfectly for this deep dive. I'm your host, and I'm here with our resident expert to basically unpack this exact dynamic. We're looking at some intense data today, specifically exploring how economic growth is tied to the rule of law.
Right. We're moving from that, very high-level macroeconomic perspective of the private equity consultant right down to the ground-level reality.
The reality of everyday entrepreneurs.
Exactly, because this theoretical concept of institutional security, it translates into very tangible daily obstacles for real people.
Totally.
I mean, the macro data about global risk mapping, it's really just the aggregate of millions of individual business owners trying to navigate fundamentally different legal frameworks.
And we're looking at a system where the architecture of the law literally determines the absolute ceiling of economic potential for those people.
It's the invisible barrier.
Right. And I want to ground this immediately in a human story because, let's be honest, macroeconomic data can feel incredibly abstract for you listening.
Sure, it gets dry fast.
Right. So there's this specific narrative in the source material about a woman named Eliana. She runs a small textile workshop right on the outskirts of São Paulo.
A very typical small business scenario.
Very typical. And for Eliana, the rule of law is not this, abstract legal concept debated by politicians in parliament. It is a literal ghost that haunts her ledger every single month.
Because she operates in what they call the Custo Brazil.
Exactly, the Custo Brazil. It's this hidden structural price of doing business in a system that basically has zero legal predictability.
Yeah, and it's exhausting.
She spends way more time navigating this labyrinth of conflicting municipal regulations and, fending off fiscal inspectors who are basically just looking for bribes than she does actually designing clothes or expanding her shop.
Right, and that Custo Brazil concept, it's the perfect encapsulation of a system running on human discretion rather than mathematical predictability.
Mathematical predictability.
Well, right, when you analyze Eliana's situation, you have to look at the mechanical failure of the regulatory environment. It's not just that there are too many rules.
Which there are.
Yes. But it's that the rules are actively contradictory and the enforcement is entirely subjective.
So it's a trap.
For example, a municipal zoning board might tell her, hey, your sewing machines have to be 3 feet from the wall for fire safety. Yeah. But then a state environmental agency comes in and demands a totally conflicting spatial arrangement for, say, noise reduction.
Oh, so she literally can't win.
Because she cannot mathematically comply with both regulations at the same time, she is forced into this state of permanent technical illegality.
And that state of permanent illegality is exactly what gives corrupt officials their leverage.
100%.
I mean, if everyone is technically breaking a rule just because the rules are impossible to satisfy, then the inspector who walks through your door holds absolute power over your livelihood.
Right, because they can always find something.
Right. Eliana detailed how an inspector will walk in, find a minor, literally unavoidable violation, and essentially offer her a choice.
Pay the official fine or the unofficial one?
Exactly. Pay an astronomical official fine that will instantly bankrupt the workshop, or, pay a smaller, unofficial bribe directly to him to make the violation magically disappear.
And that's the tragedy of it.
She described her democracy, this system that she actively votes in, that she has a say in, as feeling like a hollow shell, because the ground beneath her feet is just shifting sand.
Yeah, and deconstructing this dichotomy between, knowing the right person versus following the right law, it really reveals the foundational mechanics of why some economies develop and others stagnate.
Make that make sense for us.
Well, when knowing the right person dictates your business outcomes, the entire economy is operating on discretionary human behavior.
Which is unpredictable.
Completely unpredictable. It introduces an unquantifiable level of risk. Investors, or even just local entrepreneurs like Eliana, they can't calculate the future cost of maintaining those personal relationships.
Or satisfying the next corrupt official who walks in.
Right. You can't put a bribe in a 5-year projection.
Oh, yeah.
But in contrast, following the right law provides a mathematically calculable environment. If your tax rate is fixed and the enforcement is transparent, your business can actually build a long-term growth model.
But if the tax rate depends on whether the local magistrate had a good morning, planning is basically impossible.
It's just a guessing game at that point.
And Eliana actually contrasted her own experience with a story about her cousin, which I thought was fascinating. Her cousin moved to a small manufacturing hub in an East Asian province.
Okay, a very different environment.
Completely alien to Eliana's reality in Brazil. In that East Asian hub, the written code is absolute.
Unblinking, like the consultant said.
Exactly. If a business owner follows the exact written parameters for taxes, labor, export quotas, whatever it is, the government completely retreats. They just leave the business alone to scale.
There's no inspector shaking you down.
Zero. Because the legal framework there literally does not allow for discretionary enforcement at the street level. The rules are the rules.
Period.
Meanwhile, in Brazil, Eliana feels like cultivating a network of favors is more important than product innovation. And she realizes that's exactly what keeps her shop small, and ultimately keeps her dreams small.
Because corruption, in this context, it functions explicitly as a regressive tax on entrepreneurship.
A regressive tax, meaning it hurts the little guy the most.
It penalizes small-scale operators like Eliana who just lack the capital to purchase political influence.
Or hire massive legal teams to fight it.
Right. Large corporations, they can afford to absorb the Custo Brazil. They just internalize the legal costs, or they, directly lobby the government for special exemptions.
But small businesses can't do that.
Not. So this regressive tax structurally limits business scale across the entire lower and middle tiers of the economy.
It's like trying to run on a treadmill.
A predictable legal backbone is strictly required for freedom to be functional.
Point.
A predictable legal backbone is required for freedom to be functional. Without it, your theoretical right to participate in an economy is nullified by your practical inability to actually secure the fruits of your labor.
I look at this dynamic, and it feels very much to me like playing a really complex board game, like Monopoly.
Okay, I can see where you're going with this.
It doesn't matter how fair the voting process is for choosing the players. It doesn't matter how equally the starting money is distributed at the beginning of the game.
Right.
If the rules of the game change every single time someone rolls the dice, like if the banker can suddenly decide that Boardwalk costs 3 times as much, or that Passing Go doesn't pay out anymore, nobody is going to invest in building a strategy.
Why would you? You just hoard whatever you have.
Exactly. A player will only commit resources to the board if they know the parameters of movement and the costs of the assets are fixed and universally enforced. Which forces a really challenging analytical question for you listening. Does a vibrant democracy actually mask deep economic disenfranchisement if the underlying legal substrate is broken?
That's the haunting question, isn't it?
Yeah. Because the freedom to cast a ballot gives you this illusion of civic control. But if the resulting government fails to guarantee the integrity of a basic business contract, you are still locked out of true economic mobility.
Your board game analogy isolates the core issue perfectly. The enforcement of rules must be insulated from the players.
Right. The banker can't be changing the rules to help their friends.
Exactly. Economic freedom is entirely dependent on contractual enforcement. If property rights are subject to just arbitrary bureaucratic whims, the individual remains economically disenfranchised, regardless of whether they can vote.
And the East Asian economic trajectory provides the ultimate countermodel to this.
And the stability that attracts global capital to East Asia that allows for this massive long-term economic strategy, it's not an accident.
It wasn't just good luck.
It is the result of a very specific, deliberate state architecture. An architecture designed precisely to eliminate the exact uncertainties that cause those institutional bottlenecks in South America.
So we need to examine the mechanics they use to actually enforce predictability over discretion.
And to understand that architecture, we really have to look at the historical foundation.
Right, there's this incredible archival account in our sources about a man named Mr. Park. He was working in Seoul during the late 1970s.
A totally different world back then.
Completely. The atmosphere of that era was described as incredibly rigid, almost clinical.
Yeah.
Mr. Park worked for a burgeoning electronics firm, and his daily reality illustrates exactly how this predictability was constructed from the ground up.
Because the government officials he dealt with, they weren't his bosses.
And they certainly weren't his friends. They were partners in a strict, predictable contract. The rules of the game were set in stone.
And the parameters of that contract in South Korea during the 70s were entirely metric-driven.
What do you mean by metric-driven?
Well, the state required explicit export quotas, and they maintained incredibly strict quality standards.
Okay.
If Mr. Park's firm met those exact mathematical benchmarks, the legal and financial support from the state was guaranteed.
Yes.
The firm would get subsidized credit, they'd get preferential exchange rates, and they were protected from premature foreign competition. There was absolutely no ambiguity.
But what if they missed the targets?
If the firm failed to meet the export targets, the state support was immediately severed. Boom. Gone.
Yeah.
Regardless of any personal relationships or who knew who.
Oh, so that predictable hand allowed Mr. Park's company to take massive risks.
Because the risk was quantified.
They could invest heavily in new manufacturing equipment or, long-term research because they knew the state wasn't going to arbitrarily change the laws midstream.
Or demand a bribe to approve a factory expansion.
Right. It was a very clear trade-off. There was political silence in exchange for absolute economic certainty.
And for a generation recovering from a devastating war, that predictable hand was the first solid, reliable foundation they had ever encountered.
So from a purely developmental perspective, Mr. Park's story shows that a rigid system that uniformly follows its own written rules is infinitely more productive than a fluid system that changes the rules daily based on political pressure.
It's night and day, and what we are really unpacking here is the developmental state model.
Because that represents a fundamental departure from our Western economic orthodoxy.
So in the West, we have what's called a regulatory state.
Right.
A regulatory state governs the economy primarily through agencies empowered to protect the public against market failures.
Like preventing monopolies.
Preventing monopolistic pricing, stopping environmental degradation, or regulating predatory lending.
Okay, so the Western state basically functions as a referee.
Exactly. It ensures fair play within the boundaries of the market, but it remains largely agnostic about the specific direction the market takes.
Let me just stop and clarify this distinction for a second. The regulatory state is essentially just blowing the whistle when someone steps out of bounds, but it doesn't really care which team wins or what plays they run. But the developmental state, on the other hand, is actively drawing up the plays.
A developmental state actively intervenes to shape the economic landscape. It mobilizes the majority of its domestic capital into promising industrial sectors that are designed for maximum societal spillover. Well, if the state determines that, say, semiconductor manufacturing is the future, right, then it channels banking resources, educational focus in universities, and massive infrastructure development directly toward that singular goal. The state takes on developmental functions. It actively plans and guides the private sector rather than just policing it.
Okay. How does a state do that without simply becoming a massive, corrupt bureaucracy that just picks its friends as the winners? I mean, every time a government tries to pick winners and losers, the general assumption is that the politicians will just give the subsidies to the companies that donated to their campaigns.
Right, the crony capitalism risk. But the critical component that prevents that outcome in this model is a concept called embedded autonomy.
Embedded autonomy.
This is the mechanical blueprint of the developmental state. So first, The state apparatus is heavily insulated from short-term political pressures or the narrow interests of the corporate class.
And that's the autonomy part.
Right. Civil servants in these systems are often recruited through intensely competitive, merit-based examinations.
So it's not about who you know.
Exactly. They are granted immense prestige, long-term tenure, and compensation structures that make them highly resistant to bribery or political intimidation.
They don't have to worry about the next election cycle, so they can actually plan for the next decade. Okay, so they are autonomous because they are locked away in this bureaucratic fortress.
Yes.
If they're so isolated, how do they actually know what the economy needs? How do they avoid making terrible, disconnected decisions from an ivory tower?
And that is where the embedded nature comes into play. While the bureaucracy is politically insulated, it remains deeply connected to the realities of the industrial sector.
So
These civil servants, they spend their entire careers directly interacting with factory managers, engineers, and global supply chain logistics experts. They literally sit on giant public-private councils.
So they aren't just reading reports, they are in the weeds.
Exactly. They understand the exact constraints of importing raw materials or scaling up a production line.
Wow.
This combination of being politically autonomous but industrially embedded allows the state to set long-term national goals without being captured by special interests. They have the power to direct the capital, and they have the granular knowledge to direct it effectively.
Which brings us to another huge concept here. Plan rationality. The accounts show that state intervention in these models intentionally manipulated exchange rates, wages, and inflation to lower production costs for their targeted industries.
They were engineering the macroeconomic environment.
Exactly. To guarantee that their chosen industries would succeed on the global stage, it wasn't left to chance.
Right. Plan rationality means that market forces are utilized, but they are absolutely subordinate to a broader strategic plan.
So the market isn't the master, it's a tool.
The state might artificially suppress domestic interest rates to provide incredibly cheap loans to heavy industry.
Which effectively transfers wealth from household savers to corporate manufacturers.
Or they might implement strict capital controls to prevent wealth from leaving the country, forcing it to be reinvested domestically.
That creates a highly disciplined market economy.
Very disciplined. Short-term market rationality is just overridden by the priority of long-term industrial policy.
And that creates a profoundly safe, predictable environment for massive corporate investment, because the state is literally underwriting the risk.
Right. The state is telling you, we will not let you fail if you follow the plan.
This highlights a profound tension, though, between a free market and a disciplined market economy. If the state acts as an aggressive portfolio manager picking winners and losers based on strict, unforgiving performance metrics, it fundamentally redefines what we consider capitalism.
It really challenges our assumptions.
The deeply held Western assumption is that governments are inherently bad at allocating capital.
Right. The belief is that millions of independent consumers and investors making decentralized decisions will always outperform a centralized committee of bureaucrats.
But the East Asian model demonstrates that a state bureaucracy, if it's sufficiently insulated, strictly meritocratic, and completely predictable, can orchestrate capital allocation with devastating efficiency.
Devastating efficiency is the perfect phrase for it. They prioritize long-term industrial dominance over short-term market fluctuations.
Okay, so shifting from the historical narratives of state building to contemporary hard econometric data, this allows us to quantify the exact value of this predictability. Because the architectural blueprints of the developmental state, they translate directly into measurable economic velocity today.
The theoretical frameworks of embedded autonomy and plan rationality are entirely empirically verifiable right now. We have extensive data sets that track institutional quality against economic outcomes across diverse global regimes.
And there's this incredible data visualization in our source material mapping the life of a young analyst in Brasilia named Roberto.
Roberto's story is fascinating.
He represents this new generation of technocrats who are intensely focused on the World Bank's Rule of Law Index.
Right.
Roberto doesn't spend his time debating the personalities of local politicians or, the rhetoric of different political parties. He focuses entirely on basis points.
The cold, hard numbers.
Yes. He calculated the exact mathematical relationship between his country's legal predictability and its economic future. His core thesis is that securing just a fractional upward nudge in the Rule of Law Index would result in a drastic alteration in GDP per capita.
Wow.
which would subsequently prevent the brain drain of highly educated young professionals leaving for more stable economies.
Roberto's focus on the World Bank's Rule of Law Index is highly instructive, because that index measures the extent to which agents have confidence in and abide by the rules of society.
So it's tracking contract enforcement, property rights, the police, the courts.
It even tracks the likelihood of crime and violence. It is essentially an aggregate metric of predictability.
And Roberto recounted a specific anecdote about a neighboring district that decided to tackle its corruption problem. But they didn't do it through, like, moral campaigning or public service announcements.
No, they used mechanical engineering.
Exactly. They automated their entire legal procurement process through a digital, transparent system.
So smart.
When the government needed to buy supplies or contract construction, the bids were submitted, evaluated, and awarded through an encrypted digital platform governed by a strict, unalterable algorithm.
Which is brilliant because by entirely removing human discretion from the procurement process, the district eliminated the potential for corruption at the point of transaction.
An algorithm cannot be bribed.
Right. And it doesn't have a brother-in-law who needs a construction contract. The rules were perfectly enforced every single time.
And the result was immediate. The district instantly attracted foreign investment that had previously bypassed the region, completely due to the high Custo Brazil.
Capital flocked to the predictability.
Major manufacturing facilities arrived as a direct mathematical consequence of this newfound systemic integrity. Foreign companies looked at the digital procurement system and realized, oh, our contracts won't blink here.
Yeah.
So to Roberto, the rule of law is not a moral imperative or some philosophical debate. It is the measurable velocity of money.
And breaking down the econometric models provides a precise quantification of what Roberto observed locally, but on a global scale.
So,
the data reveals a staggering correlation. A 1-point increase in the rule of law index correlates to an approximate 92% increase in GDP per capita over time.
let me stop right there to make sure the magnitude of that is clear. A single point increase on an institutional index almost doubles the GDP per capita.
Almost doubles it. It is a massive structural dividend. It suggests that legal predictability is not merely a byproduct of wealth, but it's a primary causal driver of wealth accumulation.
That means fixing the courts and securing property rights yields a higher return on investment than discovering a new oil reserve or building a fleet of new ports.
It absolutely does, because the legal system dictates how efficiently that oil reserve is managed and whether those ports function without crippling logistical delays caused by, corrupt customs officials. Furthermore, analyzing the amplifying effect of the rule of law in non-democracies exposes a critical mathematical interaction. The data shows that the lower the degree of democratization in a country, the higher the marginal impact of legal security on economic growth.
Why would legal security matter more in an autocracy than in a democracy?
In a consolidated democracy, multiple mechanisms create institutional redundancy. You have an independent judiciary, you have frequent elections that provide electoral accountability, and you have a free press that can expose corruption.
So there are backup systems.
Exactly. If a contract is breached in a democracy, an investor has multiple avenues to seek recourse. But in a non-democratic system, those redundancies do not exist. There is no electoral accountability to punish a corrupt official, and the press might not be empowered to investigate corporate disputes. Therefore, in an autocracy, the strict enforcement of the written law is often the sole channel of predictability available to investors.
It's the only safety net.
Right. Without an unblinking contract, foreign capital will simply not enter. But when an autocracy successfully guarantees that contract, that singular guarantee becomes exponentially more valuable because it stands alone as the pillar of economic stability.
And this brings us directly to a fascinating concept in the econometric models known as the China dummy variable.
Yes, the China dummy.
When economists run standard models to predict GDP growth based on traditional variables like, capital accumulation, labor force expansion, initial income levels, the models systematically underestimate the actual GDP growth of China.
They fall short.
The reality vastly outpaces the traditional mathematical prediction.
And that systematic underestimation requires the introduction of a dummy variable to account for the positive residual.
And this positive residual proves the massive efficacy of specific institutional arrangements that are unique to the Chinese governance model.
Absolutely.
While the system may lack Western democratic redundancies, it possesses highly advanced mechanisms for legal and economic predictability. And one of the primary drivers of this is market-preserving federalism.
This is a huge concept.
Let's unpack market-preserving federalism for the listener, because federalism usually implies a division of power between a national government and local states or provinces, like in the U.S.
Right.
How does this specific structure preserve the market and drive massive growth?
So under this system, local municipalities and provincial governments are granted significant autonomy over their local economies. They are actively encouraged to compete fiercely against one another for foreign direct investment and domestic business expansion.
Almost like rival corporations competing for market share.
Exactly like rival corporations. The central government aligns the promotion and career advancement of those local officials directly with objective economic metrics.
Primarily GDP growth and employment rates within their jurisdiction, right?
Exactly.
So a local mayor is not focused on winning a popular election. They're entirely focused on proving to the central bureaucracy that they can grow their local economy faster than the mayor in the neighboring province.
If a local official implements efficient, predictable regulatory frameworks that attract manufacturing, their region's GDP rises, and that official is promoted to a higher position within the national hierarchy.
But if they mess up?
If an official allows corruption to create a hostile business environment, capital flees to a neighboring province, GDP stalls, and the official's career is essentially terminated.
Wow. So it creates a massive structural incentive for local governments to build highly efficient, technically competent bureaucracies.
Yes, it aligns the self-interest of the official perfectly with the provision of a secure, predictable environment for global capital.
And combined with selective technical bureaucracies and binding commitments to global value chains, this creates just an unbreakable economic engine.
Unbreakable.
The ability of the Chinese government to provide a highly predictable, unblinking contractual environment functions as a mathematically proven mechanism for sustaining massive long-term growth.
Because global corporations invest trillions of dollars when they know the terms of the contract will be honored and the infrastructure will be delivered exactly on schedule.
The data cleanly decouples economic flourishing from political ideology. And the objective reality is that capital seeks predictability above all else.
It's just a mathematical truth.
I think about this using a very simple physics analogy. Okay. If capital is water, the rule of law is the plumbing. Right? It does not matter what kind of political weather system is generating the rain above ground. You can have a vibrant, stormy democracy or a quiet, controlled autocracy. But if the pipes are leaky and corrupt, the water will bleed out into the soil before it ever reaches the fields.
The hydration never gets there.
Exactly. A highly inclusive political system with terrible plumbing will fail to deliver economic hydration.
Yeah.
Conversely, a completely closed political system with perfectly sealed, mathematically precise plumbing will channel that capital with immense force exactly where it needs to go.
The plumbing analogy effectively illustrates the mechanics of capital flow perfectly. And applying these mathematical models to the comparative historical reality of two specific nations, Brazil and South Korea, really provides a stark illustration of these mechanisms operating over decades. Both nations started with remarkably similar economic profiles in the mid-20th century, but they ended up on entirely divergent trajectories.
And this divergence perfectly encapsulates the long-term consequences of prioritizing legal predictability and rigorous industrial policy versus falling into what economists call the middle income trap.
Right. So in the 1960s, Brazil and South Korea were in very comparable positions. They were both developing nations transitioning from agrarian economies to industrialization.
Yet today, their positions in the global economic hierarchy are worlds apart.
Worlds apart. And the divergence in their domestic accumulation of technological and organizational capabilities requires looking closely at the incentive structures their respective states created.
The foundational difference lies in the exact nature of their industrial policies. South Korea utilized a strictly enforced helping winners, punishing losers policy.
Which goes back to Mr. Park.
Exactly. State subsidies, cheap credit, protective tariffs. They were entirely conditional. They were heavily tied to aggressive export quotas in capturing global market share.
The state essentially told domestic corporations, we will protect you and fund you, but only if you prove you can compete against the absolute best companies in the world.
And if you can't, you're out.
Right.
That forced South Korean companies to relentlessly invest in research and development. They had to constantly upgrade their technology and improve their organizational efficiency just to survive the demands of their own government.
If they failed to meet the metrics, the state cut them off and let them go bankrupt.
The plumbing was perfectly sealed and directed toward global competitiveness.
But in direct contrast, Brazil adopted a helping winners, saving losers approach under its import substitution industrialization model.
Saving losers.
Yes. Operating within a heavily closed economy with massive tariffs protecting domestic industries from foreign competition, Brazilian companies were encouraged toward rent-seeking behavior rather than innovation.
Okay, let's define rent-seeking here for you listening, because it is crucial to understanding the failure of the system. Rent-seeking is when a company tried to increase its wealth without creating any new wealth or productivity.
Instead of investing in research and development to build a better product, a rent-seeking company invests its resources into lobbying the government.
It's easier to buy a politician than build a better microchip.
Exactly. In Brazil, companies maximize their interactions with the public sector to secure permanent protections, subsidies, and favorable regulations.
And because the state was willing to save failing companies to prevent job losses, the threat of bankruptcy was completely removed.
Without the unforgiving metrics of the global market, there was absolutely no structural incentive to maximize actual productivity or push the technological frontier.
Which relates directly to the reality of modern global manufacturing, which relies heavily on global value chains. GVCs.
Building a complex good today, like a smartphone, an automobile, or an airplane, requires a vast, intricate web of contractual relationships across multiple borders.
You are sourcing microchips from one country, lithium batteries from another, and precision glass from a third.
And all of it converges on an assembly line that operates on just-in-time delivery schedules.
Right, so a weak legal system acts as an invisible, insurmountable barrier to participating in these global value chains.
So,
complex goods require strict, micro-level contract enforcement. If a supplier delivers a component 2 days late, or if a batch of materials fails a stress test, the legal system must provide immediate, predictable mechanisms for dispute resolution and financial compensation.
if contracts cannot be strictly enforced, or if customs regulations shift arbitrarily overnight, the entire supply chain collapses.
Therefore, a country with unpredictable rule of law is completely excluded from the high-value nodes of the global economy.
They're locked out.
Multinational corporations are not going to risk integrating a factory into their supply chain if that factory operates in a jurisdiction where a local judge might just arbitrarily seize a shipment or void a contract based on a bribe.
So the economy becomes trapped in low productivity sectors, like exporting raw agricultural goods or basic minerals, where the contractual complexity is extremely low.
You just dig it out of the ground and put it on a boat.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this creates an economic landscape characterized by islands of high-income activities coexisting with massive pools of low productivity.
Meaning a nation might have a highly advanced, globally competitive aerospace company operating as an isolated island, while the vast majority of the domestic economy is trapped in inefficient, informal labor.
You can visualize this structural mismatch as a high-speed train running on wooden tracks.
Wow.
Right. A nation can attempt to subsidize the winners. They can purchase the absolute best manufacturing technology from abroad and train a small cohort of elite engineers.
But if the foundational infrastructure, meaning the legal system, the speed of contract enforcement, patent protection, and the basic educational baseline of the broader workforce, is fragile and unpredictable,
the economic system can never reach its potential velocity. The heavy, high-tech train will simply crush the inadequate wooden tracks beneath it. Institutional capacity sets the absolute unbreakable speed limit for economic growth.
Okay, addressing a logical assumption is critical at this juncture.
Yeah, let's talk about the assumption.
Because the standard assumption in much of political science and development economics has been that economic growth organically acts as a cure for institutional weakness.
The rising tide lifts all boats theory.
Right. The belief is that if a country simply gets richer, maybe through the export of raw materials or initial industrialization, it will naturally develop better laws, more transparent courts, and stronger institutions.
But the data reveals a highly counterintuitive reality.
We assume that a growing middle class will naturally demand better governance, and that increased tax revenues will fund cleaner bureaucracies. But exploring the findings of the growth without governance models shatters that assumption completely.
Completely shatters it. The growth without governance models track the causal relationship between income levels and institutional quality over time. And the data shows that while good governance clearly causes higher per capita income, the reverse is not true.
Higher income exerts a weak or even negative causal effect on governance.
A negative effect. The data deconstructs the assumed virtuous circle. A rising GDP does not automatically clean up a corrupt judiciary or streamline a bloated bureaucracy.
In fact, passive economic growth often provides bad actors with vast new resources to manipulate the system to their exclusive advantage.
Which requires examining the exact mechanics of state capture.
And we are not talking about petty corruption here. We are not talking about Eliana paying $50 to a fire inspector. State capture is an entirely different scale of institutional subversion.
It's the macro level. State capture occurs when economic elites in transitional or developing economies actively use their growing wealth to purchase the fundamental rules of the game.
They don't just bribe an official to ignore a law, they purchase the drafting of the law itself.
They engage in the illicit private purchase of legislative votes, executive decrees, and regulatory frameworks. This creates an a la carte supply of laws tailored explicitly to the highest bidder.
So if a domestic monopoly starts making massive profits due to general economic growth, they do not use those profits to innovate. They use those profits to ensure the government passes a new tariff that permanently blocks any foreign competitor from entering their market. Or they use their wealth to rewrite the tax code so that their specific industry is exempt.
This dynamic actively subverts the public protection of property rights. The legal framework becomes a tool for cementing elite dominance rather than a neutral arbiter of commerce.
So as the economy grows, the legal framework actually becomes more exclusive, more corrupt, and significantly less predictable for the average entrepreneur or foreign investor.
The wealth generated by growth is weaponized against institutional reform.
The paradox here is just striking. Wealth can be used to pull up the ladder.
Pulling up the ladder, yes.
It's exactly like a successful technology startup, realizing that the best way to maintain its market dominance is not to continue innovating or building better products, but simply to use its newly acquired venture capital to buy the patent office and deny every single patent application from potential competitors. Passive economic growth will not organically fix broken institutions. Without targeted interventions to structurally secure the rule of law, economic expansion merely funds the entrenchment of elite capture. The system rots from the top down, fueled by its own superficial success.
And synthesizing all this data, the historical narratives of East Asia, the econometric realities of state capture, it allows us to map out the true matrix of global institutional success and failure.
The institutional matrix.
Right. It highlights the complex, often nonlinear interplay between political inclusivity and legal security. And focusing specifically on the Brazilian bottleneck requires examining sophisticated statistical analyses known as Granger causality tests.
Okay, before we get into the results, let's define what a Granger causality test actually measures so the mechanics of this data are clear for you listening.
Sure. A Granger causality test is a statistical hypothesis test used to determine whether one time series is useful in forecasting another.
In economics, it helps determine if a specific change in variable X systematically precedes and predicts a change in variable Y.
Exactly. When researchers apply this test to the institutional matrix, they isolate different components of governance to see which specific factors actually drive GDP growth.
And the results of those tests fundamentally shift how we look at the problem. The tests indicate that a broad, generalized rule of law index, which includes things like human rights and democratic voting procedures, does not predict short-term GDP growth as strongly or as reliably as the highly specific control of corruption index.
The structural deficit is entirely rooted in bureaucratic integrity.
Bureaucratic integrity.
Right. Investors in capital markets are less reactive to the political structure of the government and highly reactive to the day-to-day integrity of the bureaucracy. The exact friction points that define this deficit are staggering in their inefficiency, and they really illustrate the mathematical cost of a broken system.
The data provides exact numbers for these friction points. In Brazil, judicial sluggishness requires an average of 660 days to resolve basic routine contract disputes.
660 days.
That is nearly 2 years of frozen capital and strategic paralysis for a business simply trying to enforce a signed agreement.
And furthermore, there is profound normative instability, evidenced by the creation of over 390,000 distinct tax rolls since the current constitution was enacted in 1988.
390,000 tax rolls. It is mathematically impossible for any small or medium-sized enterprise to comply with 390,000 shifting tax rolls.
Third.
This normative instability guarantees that businesses operate in a state of permanent legal vulnerability, exposing them to selective regulatory capture. The system protects well-connected insiders who can navigate the chaos while aggressively penalizing new entrants and foreign competitors.
The final synthesis of all available data points to a singular, unavoidable conclusion regarding economic development.
And that conclusion strips away a lot of the ideological assumptions we carry about how the world should work versus how it actually operates.
True development relies unconditionally on neutral institutions. This requires specialized courts that function with mechanical efficiency, processing disputes based entirely on precedent and written law rather than the identities of the litigants.
It requires stable, comprehensible tax systems that allow for reliable long-term corporate planning over a decade or more.
Most importantly, it requires technically autonomous regulatory agencies populated through strict meritocratic appointments, completely insulated from the shifting winds of populist politics or elite state capture.
The ultimate architecture of prosperity relies on the cold, mathematical reliability of rules over the unpredictable warmth of human discretion. When the legal substrate is unyielding and fair, economic velocity takes care of itself, decoupling the destiny of capital from the noise of the political spectrum.